Move her off the Tuesday corporate slot, Spencer Quillen said, tapping the laminated schedule card against his palm without looking up from it. She's a liability booking. Put her Thursday with the walk-ons where she won't be in anybody's way. Marisol Devereaux didn't answer right away. She was close enough to the lane rail to see the old woman in the quilted barn coat standing 8 feet off, close enough to know the old woman had heard every word of it, and she watched Winifred Pickens do nothing at all except reach up with 2 fingers and touch something small and metal pinned inside her coat, the way a person checks a wound to see if it's still there. Why does the old woman check a bent piece of steel no bigger than a thumbnail before she'll take a shot the range's own equipment says is already lined up? Nobody asked her that question yet. Nobody in the small crowd gathering by the 1,200-yard lane had any reason to. What they had was a Tuesday booking of consultants in fleece vests who'd paid for a team-building day of long-range shooting and free coffee, and what they saw was a stooped grandmother in a barn coat the color of creek clay, signing herself onto a lane log like she had every right to be there, which, as it happened, she did. One of the consultants, a big laughing man named Nothing Anyone Would Remember by Supper, elbowed his colleague and said it loud enough to carry, "Let Grandma try the 1,200. I'll put money on it." Somebody else laughed the kind of laugh that isn't really about the joke, and then there was a number attached, and then there was a second number when the first one didn't sound big enough to be funny, and inside of 90 seconds, 4 grown men who had never fired a rifle at anything beyond a paper target at 100 yards had constructed a wager $300 deep against a woman who had said, up to that point, not one single word. Quillen saw an opportunity dressed as a joke and did not let it pass him. He had a corporate contract worth renewing and a liability line on his roster he'd been trying to walk off the books for a month, and here was a chance to solve both problems at once and get a laugh doing it. He set his laminated card down on the rail, unhurried, the corner already soft and gray from a habit of thumbing it when a plan wasn't cooperating. If you've ever watched someone twice your age read a room, a wind, or a life better than the machine in front of them, you already know where this is going. But nobody on that rail knew it yet. What they knew was an old woman standing very still while younger, louder people decided out loud what she was worth, and a range that had been calibrated, though none of them knew this either, by her own 2 hands the better part of 6 decades before any of them were born. Winifred didn't turn toward the laughing man, and she didn't turn toward Quillen. She looked instead past both of them, out across the gap where the quarry walls fell away into open air and the flags down at 400 yards stood at one angle and the flags out past 900 stood at another, and something in the set of her jaw suggested she was already doing arithmetic nobody had asked her to do. The wind flag pin came out of her breast pocket a second time, briefer now, checked and returned before anyone but Marisol thought to notice. Whatever it told her, she kept to herself. She always had. The quilted barn coat had gone the color of creek clay a long time before that Tuesday. The collar soft with wear, the sleeves rolled twice at each cuff to show forearms more sinew than flesh, ropey and sun-spotted and entirely unbothered by the cold coming off the quarry stone. She moved to the lane rail the way a woman moves when one shoulder simply will not lift past a certain point and never will again, turning her whole body rather than raising the arm, a small, deliberate rotation she'd stopped thinking about years ago because thinking about it never once helped. She signed the lane log the way she always did, in the same hand she'd used on forms for 50 years, the letters upright and slightly too careful. A schoolteacher's hand pressed into a habit long after the schoolroom was gone. Before her pen left the page, she touched the coat pocket once more, not for luck, though a stranger could be forgiven for thinking so. She was confirming, the way another person checks that a door's locked, that the small steel vein pinned inside still sat at the angle she'd filed into it herself in 1967. A bend no factory made and no catalog sold, hers alone, carried on every range day since. 80 miles east, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the diesel shop he'd retired from a decade back, Otis Pickens was doing what he did every Tuesday whether she asked him to or not. He had her rifle case open on the table, the felt lining brushed clean, a rag and a tin of light oil laid out in the order he always laid them out, and he worked the hinges and the latches with the unhurried attention of a man tending something that mattered to somebody he loved more than he had words for. He never asked why Tuesday. He'd stopped asking why Tuesday sometime in the second decade of their marriage, once he understood that some habits are their own kind of vow, and that a woman who checked a piece of bent steel before every shot might also need a case that opened clean and closed tight every single time, whether or not she ever said so out loud. Back at the rail, the corporate crowd was still laughing, still doubling the wager, still entirely unaware that they were describing, in tones meant to be funny, a woman who had spent 23 years teaching soldiers to read wind the way most men read weather on a porch. She let them talk. She had learned that a long time ago, too, that the loud ones eventually run out of things to say, and that the quiet in between is where the actual work gets done. Quillen, for his part, was good at his job, whatever else could be said of him that Tuesday, and it showed 20 minutes later when the corporate group's contact, a sharp-voiced woman named Devon, who ran procurement for the firm booking the day, cornered him at the check-in counter about a scheduling collision with the archery range that threatened to unravel the whole afternoon's itinerary. Quillen didn't flinch. He pulled up the master calendar, found 45 minutes nobody else had noticed were free, split the archery slot without anyone feeling shorted, and had Devon laughing again inside of 3 minutes, thanking him for the save. It was, in its way, an impressive thing to watch, a man solving a real problem with real skill under real pressure, and Marisol noted it the way she noted most things about him, competent and entirely too pleased with his own competence. That same fluency was what let him turn back to the wager at the rail without missing a beat, sliding into the joke like it was simply the next line item on his schedule. "Tell you what," he said, loud enough for the fleece vests to hear, already reaching for the rack behind the counter. "She wants the 1200 lane. She can have it, with this." He came back with a rifle nobody had fired in competition in 15 years, an old bolt gun the range kept mostly for wall decoration and insurance photographs, its stock scuffed pale at the grip, its optic a decade behind anything a serious shooter would trust. He set it on the counter like a punchline. "Obsolete, but she's earned it," he said. And the fleece vests laughed harder at that than at anything so far, and one of them clapped, and Marisol did not laugh at all. She watched Winifred's hand come up and rest, without any hurry whatsoever, on the old rifle's stock, and she watched the old woman's face do absolutely nothing that could be called offended. Winifred didn't answer the joke. She picked up the rifle, checked the bore with the ease of long habit, and carried it to the rail without a word. And it was that silence, more than anything said aloud, that made Marisol's stomach do a slow turn she couldn't yet explain. Out past the rail, the day held 400 yards of open air, then the true drop of the quarry gap, then the long climb back up to where the steel gong waited at 1200, small as a coin from where they stood. The range's digital wind meter, mounted on a post at the firing line, blinked a steady reading in green numbers nobody in the crowd thought to doubt. Winifred didn't look at it. She stood a long moment reading the flags instead, the near one snapping hard, the far one barely stirring, and the gap between what those two flags were telling her and what the green numbers said was a gap she'd spent a lifetime learning to see. She took the pin from her pocket one more time, held it flat on her palm, and watched how the last of the light caught its bent vein and said nothing at all, though the fleece vests had grown loud enough by then that her silence barely registered as strange. Somebody called out, half a joke and half a genuine question, asking how long Grandma needed to just stand there, and Winifred, without turning, said only, "Your meter's 4 feet off the ground. The wind that matters is 40 feet up over the gap." She said it plain, the way a person reports a fact rather than argues a point, and went back to watching the flags, and the crowd's laughter thinned by half, though none of them yet understood why. The impatience built the way weather builds, in stages nobody names until it's already arrived. A shifted weight here, a checked watch there, one of the fleece vests muttering that they hadn't paid for a staring contest. Quillen let a full minute of it run before he said, not unkindly but not gently either, that the lane wasn't reserved past 4 o'clock, and did she want to shoot or not? Winifred didn't answer that either. She watched the far flag dip, hold, dip again, and something in the rhythm of it settled into her the way a held breath finally lets go, and only then did her free hand move to the old rifle's stock. She didn't lift the rifle to her shoulder the way the young men behind the counter had been taught in whatever half-day course passed for training now. She turned her whole body instead, Feet first, hips following, the bad shoulder staying exactly where it wanted to stay, while the rest of her rotated around it until the stock met her in the one position that had never once failed her. And only then did the rifle come up, already seated, already hers. She checked the pin one final time, a half-second glance, no more, and returned it to her pocket and breathed out slow, and the whole rail went quiet in the particular way that happens when a crowd realizes all at once and without agreeing to it that something is actually about to occur. She fired once. The gong rang clean across 1,200 yards, a single bright note carried back to the firing line on the same air she'd just finished reading, and the sound arrived a full second after the crowd had already seen the steel jump, so that for one strange beat they were cheering, or trying to, before they'd even heard it land. Nobody at the rail laughed after that. The big man who'd started the wager stood with his mouth still open on a word he hadn't finished saying. Marisol was the only one looking at the wind meter instead of the target, and she watched its green numbers finally shift, a full 3 seconds after Winifred had already fired, catching up to a gust that had come and gone by the time the machine noticed it existed. The pin in the old woman's pocket had known it was coming before the gust had fully arrived. The meter only knew it was there once it was already leaving. Quillen's laminated card had gone still in his hand. He looked at the gong and at the meter's late correction and at Winifred setting the borrowed rifle down on the rail with the same unhurried care she'd used to pick it up. And for the length of several long seconds he did not say a single word, which for a man who always had something to say was its own kind of answer. The applause, when it finally came, was ragged and a little stunned, the fleece vests clapping because clapping was easier than saying out loud what they were thinking. Winifred accepted none of it directly. She thanked no one, took no bow, only reached once more into her breast pocket to touch the pin, a small private gesture that had nothing to do with the gong or the money or the crowd, and everything to do with a habit 60 years deep that had simply, once again, done exactly what she'd built it to do. Marisol went looking for the paperwork before the crowd had even finished talking about what they'd seen, because logging a lane feet for the day's records was procedure, and procedure was the one language she trusted more than her own instincts. She pulled up Winifred Pickens's membership file, expecting the usual thin folder of a decades-old walk-on account, and found instead a credential field she had to read twice, original instructor certification unverified. It sat there in flat gray text, official-looking and entirely wrong, because Marisol had watched with her own eyes what that credential was supposed to mean, not 90 seconds earlier, ringing steel at 1,200 yards with a rifle nobody had zeroed in a decade. She checked the file's edit history out of the same procedural instinct, and the two most recent changes to that field, 6 weeks apart, both traced back to the same login, S. Quillen, Facility Operations. She sat with that a moment, the number of it, twice in 6 months, not an oversight repeated by accident, but a decision revisited on purpose, and something cold settled into her that had nothing to do with the quarry wind. She found him at the check-in counter fielding a call from Devin, the procurement contact, whose firm was already talking renewal terms for next season, contingent. Devin was saying loud enough for Marisol to catch through the receiver, on the range demonstrating consistent programming. No surprises, no unpredictable variables, a smooth corporate product with nothing on the books that couldn't be explained in a single line to a board somewhere. Quillen was nodding along, agreeable, already halfway to a yes, and Marisol understood, watching him, exactly what an old woman with an unverified credential and a habit of showing up on the Tuesday slot looked like to a man trying to sell that particular story to that particular client. She waited until he'd hung up before she set her tablet down in front of him, the credential field open on the screen, and asked him, plainly, why it said what it said. Quillen didn't reach for the laminated card this time. He thumbed its corner anyway, a reflex with nothing left to hold, and told her the field had been flagged for review pending updated paperwork, an explanation that might have satisfied someone who hadn't just watched the paperwork subject put a bullet through steel at 1,200 yards on a rifle he'd handed her as a joke. Marisol didn't argue with him. She had learned, working under him for one full season, that arguing with Spencer Quillen was like arguing with a weather report he'd written himself. She only said that the board vote on the rebrand was scheduled for the end of the day, the same day the founding instructor history plaque was due at the printer, and that if the credential stayed unverified past that vote, whatever name had once belonged in that plaque's oldest line would simply not be there anymore. Quietly, the way so many things go missing without anyone deciding out loud to remove them. Quillen said that wasn't his call to make. He said it the way a man says a true thing he has arranged very carefully to be true, and Marisol, watching him say it, understood for the first time that he might actually believe himself, that a man could spend 18 months rewriting a roster one small field at a time and convince himself the whole way through that he was only cleaning up paperwork, never once looking directly at what the paperwork used to protect. Out at the rail, Winifred stood a little apart from the still buzzing crowd, coat collar up against the quarry's cooling air, and looked back down the 1,200 yards she'd just answered, and said nothing about any of it, because none of it had reached her yet. She had come to check a wind. She had not come to defend a file she didn't know was being erased. Colonel Sawyer Rutherford arrived at Cutback Ridge a little after 4, in the gray sedan the State Guard liaison office always sent, carrying a folder he'd been assigned to bring for a modernization inspection Quillen had spent a month preparing to impress him with. He shook Quillen's hand, accepted the tour offer, walked the first 50 yards of it with the polite patience of a man who has sat through 100 such tours before. Then his eyes found the old woman standing near the 1,200-yard rail in a barn coat, the color of creek clay, and the tour, for all practical purposes, stopped. He didn't ask Quillen who she was. He crossed the gravel toward her himself, past the fleece vests still murmuring about the shot, and stood in front of her a long moment before he spoke. And what he said was not her name at all, but a designation, 3 syllables from a service record he had inherited custody of, rather than lived through himself, spoken low and certain, the way a man reads a password he's carried a long time without ever expecting to need it. Winifred's face changed only slightly, a narrowing at the eyes that had nothing to do with the light. "That's a name I haven't answered to in a while," she said, and it was the most words she had spoken all afternoon. Rutherford didn't explain himself right away. He set his inspection folder on the rail's flat cap, unzipped it, and drew out a single photograph, old enough that its edges had gone soft as cloth, a young private in a fatigue cap squinting into a sun that had set decades before anyone standing there that day was born. He laid it face up on the rail in front of her without a word, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved. Not Quillen, not Marisol, not the fleece vests who had gone quiet the way rooms go quiet when they sense, before they understand, that something has shifted weight. Winifred looked at the photograph a long moment, and something crossed her face that hadn't been there for the wager, or the gong, or any of it. "That's your father," she said. It wasn't a question. "He never told most people what happened out here," Rutherford said. "He told me. Once, when I was about to ship out myself, and he thought I needed to hear it more than he needed to keep it quiet." He looked at the flags, still snapping over the gap, and then at her. "Live fire exercise, 39 years ago. A round that should never have chambered did. Everyone around him started shouting, moving, doing exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong speed. He said there was one instructor on that line who didn't raise her voice once. Talked him through clearing it like she was reading him a grocery list. He said he'd have panicked himself into a casualty report if she'd sounded scared for even a second." He paused. He never forgot her name. "I only ever knew it from the discharge file I found in his effects, until I read your credential paperwork last night and saw it listed as unverified. I didn't know I'd ever be standing in front of the woman who owned it." Marisol, off to the side, felt something come loose in her chest that she would later fail to describe to anyone as anything other than relief. The full account, once Rutherford gave it, took less time to tell than the wager had taken to lose interest in itself, because that was how Winifred had always told things, and how, it turned out, his father had told it too. Plain, sequential, empty of anything that might be mistaken for a performance. A malfunction on the line. A private frozen mid-motion with a chambered round he didn't know how to clear. An instructor who walked over without hurrying put her hand flat and steady on his rifle and talked him through 4 simple steps in a voice that never once climbed, because she understood, long before most people ever learn it, that panic is contagious and calm can be too if you're patient enough to spend it. "I didn't do anything special," Winifred said when Rutherford had finished. "I did what I was trained to do, and then I taught other people to do it too. That's the whole of it." Rutherford asked her plainly what she wanted done about the credential, about the plaque, about the vote scheduled for the end of that same day. Winifred didn't ask for Quillen's job. She didn't ask for an apology or a headline or the $300 that had started the whole afternoon, which she'd already told the fleece vests to keep for the local children's shooting program instead. She asked only that the founding instructor plaque list her name correctly, the way it should have all along, because a range built on a course she'd surveyed with her own two hands in 1967 owed its accuracy to that layout, whether anyone remembered saying so or not. Quillen stood through all of it without the laminated card in his hand at all, having set it down somewhere on the counter and apparently forgotten it. When Rutherford turned to him and asked, evenly, why the credential had been marked unverified twice in 6 months under his own login, Quillen had a window, brief and real, in which he could have offered the excuse he'd already half-built for Marisol at the counter. He didn't take it. He said instead that he'd start pulling every file he'd touched in the last year and bring them to Rutherford himself, unedited, before the board vote convened, and he went and did exactly that, carrying the folders out to the rail 2 and 3 at a time, not waiting to be asked twice. It was not forgiveness Winifred offered him in return, exactly, because there had been no real harm done to forgive beyond paperwork. And paperwork can be fixed. It was smaller than that, and plainer. She told him, once the last folder was on the rail, that a man who ran a good range would do well to remember that the walk-ons were the reason there was a range to run at all, and Quillen, hearing it, said nothing back, only nodded once, the nod of a man filing something away for good this time instead of burying it. She had not come back to be believed. She had come back because Tuesday was the day she checked the wind, and that had never once required anyone else's permission. 3 weeks later, the reprinted founding instructor plaque went up on the quarry wall inside the range's low stone entrance, her name restored to the oldest line where it had always belonged, and beside it, mounted under a small glass case the size of a shoebox lid, sat the hand-filed steel wind flag pin, its bent vane fixed at the exact angle she'd calibrated in 1967, the year she surveyed the very ground the range now stood on. 9 years into a career nobody standing at the unveiling that afternoon had fully understood, until the day the gong rang. Otis Pickens was waiting at the range gate when she arrived that morning, same as he'd waited most Tuesdays for 56 years, her rifle case already loaded in the bed of the truck, hinges oiled, latches sound, because some habits don't need an unveiling to keep being kept. He didn't make a speech about the plaque. He never had been one for speeches. He just reached over and squeezed her hand once, the way he had after every range day for longer than either of them bothered counting anymore, and walked in beside her toward the stone wall where her name now sat correctly for the first time in decades. Marisol stood near the entrance checking names off a list she barely needed anymore, and Colonel Rutherford stood a little apart with his father's photograph tucked back inside his folder where it belonged, and Quillen off to one side had already quietly changed the Tuesday schedule so the lane log read, veteran walk-ons first, corporate bookings after, a small line item nobody but Marisol seemed to notice he'd rewritten in his own hand. The late light came in low and flat through the gap in the quarry wall the way it always had at that hour, catching the small glass case just so, and for one long moment the old bent pin threw back a thin bright line across the stone, the same angle it had held since 1967, unchanged by any of it, not the wager, not the vote, not the 39 years between one private's steadied hands and his son's arrival at this gate. Some corrections don't come from an audit. They come from someone who finally opens the right file. And there the pin stayed, at rest under its glass, angled exactly as she'd filed it, catching the late light through the quarry wall.